My name is Caroline Myers. I'm 33 years old now. When I was 18, my father told me that paying for my college would be a waste because I'd just get married and forget everything I studied. He wasn't poor. He just didn't see me as an investment. I didn't argue. I simply applied to a night college, took 2 jobs, and erased him from every version of my future. He stayed in the banking world, always saying, "In this business, it's all about connections." 10 years later, he showed up for a job interview at the startup where I was the chief operating officer. I had already fired his old boss. Before I tell you how that interview ended, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button if you've ever been underestimated by your own family. When I got my college acceptance letter, I didn't expect a celebration, but I guess I hoped for something. A nod, a moment of pride, maybe even the faintest sign that I mattered in the long run of his world. Instead, my father barely looked up from the financial paper he read every morning like scripture. I had walked into the kitchen holding the envelope, my name typed neatly across the front, hands slightly trembling, not out of fear, but anticipation. I had worked for this, and I thought maybe, just maybe, it would shift something in the air between us. He set his coffee down and gave me a glance that felt more like an audit than attention. "College?" he asked. I nodded. "Full-time or part-time?" I told him I'd been accepted into a full-time program, economics major. I had picked it thinking it might interest him, align with the banking world he moved in so effortlessly. He gave a short laugh. "You really think that's necessary?" he said. "You'll get married before you ever use half of that." It landed like a slap wrapped in silk. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just dismissed the entirety of my ambition with a few casual words and went back to his spreadsheet of dividends and projections. To him, my future was a soft detail, a placeholder before I became someone else's problem, someone's wife, someone's mother, someone no longer worth betting on. My mother stood near the sink. She didn't speak. Her eyes flickered toward me, then away. That was her language silence and soft avoidance. I knew then that no one would intervene. No one would argue on my behalf. I was on my own, not just financially, but emotionally too. That same afternoon, I filled out applications for 2 part-time jobs. I told the college I'd be switching to the evening track. I found a small studio apartment 20 minutes from campus, and I moved out before the month ended. There was no fight, no dramatic departure. I just packed a suitcase, left a note, and closed the chapter they had written for me. But none of it hurt as much as realizing that he wasn't surprised. Not that I got in. Not that I was leaving, but that I dared to think he'd be impressed. My father ran a small regional banking chain, nothing massive, but enough to earn him invitations to the Chamber of Commerce and his face on brochures. He wore suits even on Sundays and always answered the phone with his full name. He believed in hierarchy, in pedigree, in earning your place, but only if that place matched the blueprint he respected. A daughter with night classes and 2 jobs wasn't in that blueprint. Over the next few years, I saw him occasionally weddings, funerals, a forced Christmas dinner or 2. We never discussed my schooling. He would ask vague questions like, "Still working?" or "Got your own place?" in the same tone someone uses to inquire if the weather's holding up. He never asked what I was learning or what I wanted to do after I graduated. One evening, during a family gathering, I overheard him talking to a friend about his son's MBA at Wharton. He spoke with pride, rich and loud, about legacy and opportunity. The friend asked if he had more kids, and he said, "Just 1 daughter. She's doing something with numbers, I think." I stood in the hallway, gripping a plastic cup of ginger ale, realizing I wasn't a disappointment to him, I was a footnote. And that became my fuel. Not rage, not revenge, but a deep, anchored decision. I would never ask him for anything again. not money, not advice, not approval, and definitely not respect. I would earn that from the world, not from a man who looked at his daughter and saw a liability dressed as potential. The first semester nearly broke me. I had underestimated what it meant to survive alone, not just financially, but mentally. I wasn't used to making decisions without a safety net. There was no one to double-check my schedule, no one to remind me when tuition deadlines were due, no one to warn me that textbooks would cost almost as much as rent. I was 18, technically adult, but still aching for some form of stability. And yet, the most persistent thing in my life was absence. My day started before the sun came up. I worked mornings at a local diner, the kind with cracked vinyl booths, and the same 5 regulars who tipped in quarters and advice no one asked for. I wore a name tag that said Lena because someone had misspelled Caroline on my first day, and I didn't bother correcting it. From there, I rushed to campus for 2 afternoon classes, then headed to my second job at a pharmacy until closing. My textbooks came with me everywhere, dog-eared and full of notes in margins too small for what I was trying to hold on to. I didn't tell anyone from my old life what I was doing. My high school friends scattered into state schools and dorms, some with parents who helped with tuition, others with boyfriends who carried their laundry baskets. I envied them sometimes, but more often, I envied their simplicity, the ease with which they moved through days that weren't stitched together with duct tape and desperation. At night, I came home to a one-room apartment that smelled faintly of someone else's cooking and always felt too cold, even in August. There was no space for a dining table, so I ate on the floor. I had a twin mattress on the ground, a second-hand laptop, and one chipped mug. But what I did have, what I clung to, was the clarity that everything I was building on my own. Sometimes, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if I was making a mistake. I knew girls who had taken easier paths, moved in with boyfriends, dropped out, started jobs they didn't love but that paid well enough to soften the future. But every time I imagined quitting, I saw my father's face. Not angry, not disappointed, just bored. The way he'd looked at me the morning I told him I got in, that was worse than rage, indifference. The belief that I wasn't even worth arguing with. So I pushed forward. There were nights I cried quietly into a towel because I didn't want the neighbors to hear. Days when my stomach growled during lectures because I'd skipped lunch to afford printer ink. And yet, I never missed a class. I sat in the front row, answered every question I could, and kept a binder so organized it became a joke among my classmates. I wasn't smarter than them. I was just more terrified of failure. Support didn't come in the form I hoped. My mom would occasionally text, asking if I was doing okay, but never offered to help. I don't blame her, really. She was trapped in her own quiet compromises, orbiting around my father's authority. I don't think she knew how to support a daughter who chose to walk away. Instead, I found glimmers of encouragement in strangers. A professor who returned my paper with the note, "You write like someone with a lot to prove." A customer at the diner who once left a $20 tip and said, "You've got good posture for someone up this early." A classmate who shared her notes with me after I overslept once, no questions asked. They didn't know what they were giving me. They didn't know how their smallest gestures stitched together the faith I needed to keep going. But they mattered. Because when you choose yourself in a world that expects you to wait for permission, every moment of grace feels like a revolution. I didn't have support in the way people imagine it. No trust fund, no mentor, no father who cared whether I failed or not. But I had something better. I had momentum. And I was learning how to turn that into power. I became fluent in numbers, not because I loved them, but because they were the only language that made my world make sense. Every dollar had a purpose. Every receipt got filed. Every line on my monthly spreadsheet was a tiny battlefield between what I needed and what I could live without. Some people learn financial literacy in college courses or by watching their parents balance checkbooks at the kitchen table. I learned it by necessity, by trial, error, and the quiet panic of realizing I had 3 days until rent was due and $17 in my bank account. My apartment was cheap, but not forgiving. The building was old and the utilities unpredictable. One month the heater blew out and I had to sleep in 2 hoodies and socks layered under my jeans. Another month, my water got shut off because I mistimed a bill by 2 days. I learned to negotiate late fees over the phone like a defense attorney, voice calm, explanations rehearsed. I just started a new job, I'd say, even when I hadn't. Could you give me until Friday? Some said no. Some sighed and gave me grace. It was roulette every month. Grocery shopping was a math exam. I used a calculator as I walked the aisles, rounding up everything I placed in the cart. I memorized price per ounce faster than class notes. If something wasn't on sale, it didn't exist. I learned how to make $5 stretch across 4 meals and how to say no to dinner invites without sounding like I was ashamed, which, honestly, I was. But I had gotten good at hiding it. The school bookstore was a cruel joke. A single economics textbook cost more than my weekly paycheck, so I bought used copies online or borrowed them from the library, sometimes taking photos of entire chapters on my phone so I wouldn't have to check them out again. I waited in line at the print center for hours, timing my visits between classes and shifts. When I couldn't afford ink, I rewrote key points by hand and taped them to the wall above my mattress. My bedroom looked like a serial killer's office, with flashcards and sticky notes instead of posters. I applied for every scholarship I could find, even the ones with ridiculous essays or criteria I barely met. I wrote about resilience, about women in business, about being the first in my family to pursue finance, which wasn't entirely true, but truth bends when you're trying to survive. I wasn't trying to manipulate anyone. I was just trying to make the numbers work. And every now and then, they did. I remember getting a $300 grant from a local bank's Future Leaders program. It wasn't much, but I cried in the bathroom when I saw the email. That $300 meant I could keep my apartment for another month. It meant I didn't have to choose between gas and groceries. It meant someone somewhere thought I was worth investing in, even if my father never did. I also found work as a part-time assistant for a small business consultant. The job wasn't glamorous, but it taught me more than any textbook. I learned how cash flow worked in real life. I saw how invoices stacked up, how vendors got prioritized, how marketing budgets were justified line by line. I listened in on calls where clients tried to negotiate terms, delay payments, or quietly back out of deals. I took notes on everything, not just what was said, but how it was said. It felt like watching a new dialect unfold, one that I would someday speak fluently. And I would. At night, I studied alone, surrounded by silence so loud it felt like pressure. I read until my vision blurred. I took practice quizzes twice, sometimes 3 times, not because I didn't understand the material, but because I needed to be bulletproof. I couldn't afford to be average, not when failure meant starting over without backup. There were moments when I hated how much energy it took just to stay afloat, when I resented classmates who could afford to intern for free while I hustled for every dollar, when I envied the ease with which others assumed the future would catch them. But eventually, something shifted. The numbers started to work in my favor. A professor nominated me for a departmental award. My GPA edged higher with each semester. I got better at budgeting, at anticipating the hidden costs of everything from parking fees to class projects. I even started saving $5 here, $10 there. Nothing impressive, but enough to prove to myself that I was no longer just surviving. I was beginning to build. It didn't look like much on paper. No one posted about me on LinkedIn. My dad certainly wasn't bragging to his golf buddies. But in my world, in the math I lived by, it was the beginning of something real, because for the first time, the numbers weren't just adding up. They were multiplying. My first real opportunity came in the form of a job posting stapled to a corkboard in the economics department. It was crooked, printed in grayscale, and barely legible, but something about the words "operations assistant" caught my eye. The company name meant nothing to me then. Just a 6-letter startup with a clunky website and no recognizable investors. But they were offering part-time hours with flexible scheduling and a paid hourly rate. That was more than most internships. So I applied. The office was nothing like the places my father talked about. No polished mahogany furniture or leather chairs. No receptionist in a pencil skirt announcing visitors by last name. It was a concrete box on the 3rd floor of a refurbished warehouse with frayed rugs, second-hand desks, and an espresso machine that groaned louder than the CEO when code broke in production. The team was almost entirely male guys in faded hoodies, startup tees, and Allbirds, coding at breakneck speed and swearing when Slack went down. They weren't intimidating. They were fast. I remember walking in on my first day and catching the tail end of a product meeting. One guy was explaining how a payment loop had broken in their API. I didn't understand the vocabulary yet, but I could tell the stakes were high. They were trying to process transactions faster than the legacy systems used by banks, and if they pulled it off, they could become the infrastructure behind a dozen B2B platforms. It was the most chaotic, ambitious thing I had ever seen, and I wanted in. They assigned me basic tasks organizing supplier contracts, updating invoices, flagging payment errors. I kept a notebook in my bag and wrote down everything I didn't understand. Every acronym, every error message. Every time someone said, "This is how Stripe does it," I Googled Stripe that night until I could explain their business model in my sleep. I refused to be the intern who just fetched coffee. The men around me didn't ignore me, but they didn't quite see me either. They spoke in fast bursts, interrupted each other constantly, and rarely looked up. I had to insert myself with precision, asking questions only when I'd already guessed the answer, offering fixes that had at least a 70% chance of working. I knew the margin of error for women in these spaces was microscopic. If I fumbled, I'd become the "she means well" hire. If I delivered, I might become invisible in a more useful way, someone they relied on without realizing it. So, I made myself indispensable. I stayed late without being asked. I rewrote their inventory tracking in a shared spreadsheet that actually worked. I caught a decimal mistake in one of their investor reports that could have caused major embarrassment. I did it all without seeking credit. Not because I didn't want it, but because I knew credit, when demanded, is often denied. But when earned quietly, it sticks. It took 3 months before they stopped calling me the student. One afternoon, during a crisis with a client's integration, I suggested a rerouting logic that saved the entire contract. No one said, "Good job." They just implemented it. That was enough. One of the lead engineers, Jack, started asking for my opinion during meetings. Then he started including me in cross-department threads. Soon, I wasn't just sitting at the table, I was budgeting for the table. But there were moments of friction, too. Moments when I heard jokes I wasn't supposed to hear, when someone commented on how aggressive she's gotten, as if being decisive was a defect. One manager once asked me, "How did a girl like you end up in operations?" And I had to smile and pretend he didn't just slap every part of me with a sentence. I learned to play the long game. I started auditing our operational costs, suggesting small cuts that saved us thousands without making noise. I built dashboards no one asked for, but everyone used. And one morning, our CFO pulled me aside and asked how I learned all this. I shrugged and said, "Survival math." He didn't get it, but I did. Eventually, they offered me a full-time role. Not because they were generous, but because they couldn't afford to lose me. And that's when I saw the shift. I wasn't the woman in the room. I was the person they relied on to keep the machine running. I didn't belong there because I had permission. I belonged because I had earned my seat bolt by bolt. And the tighter I held that seat, the more the power shifted slowly, but undeniably, in my direction. There's a moment when you realize you're no longer invisible. It doesn't come with a promotion or a plaque on the door. It's quieter than that. It sneaks up in the way people start to pause when you speak, how they repeat your phrasing in meetings without even realizing it, how they glance toward you for confirmation before making a decision. That moment happened for me about 6 months after I joined full-time, during a particularly chaotic product launch week when everything was on fire and no one was pretending otherwise. We were trying to onboard a major client, a fintech company out of Chicago with a reputation for being meticulous and temperamental. Our tech team was behind schedule, and the integration had bugs no one could trace. Everyone was exhausted. One night, around 10 p.m., we were all gathered in the main work area eating cold pizza and arguing about next steps. Tensions were high, voices louder than usual, frustration thick in the air. I sat quietly, watching the whiteboard fill with half-baked ideas, none of them solving the root problem. Then, Jack, the lead engineer, turned to me and said, "Caroline, what would you do?" It wasn't performative. It wasn't some patronizing test. It was a genuine question from someone who was stuck and knew I might not be. I walked to the board, erased 2 lines, and drew out a simplified architecture reroute that prioritized processing load over UI feedback. I didn't over-explain. I didn't preface it with just an idea. I laid it out like I'd done it 100 times. They listened, they implemented, and it worked. From that night forward, something changed. I became part of the actual conversation, not just the cleanup crew. People started looping me in earlier, asking for input on pricing models, vendor negotiations, even hiring decisions. And one day, in the middle of a leadership meeting, our CFO said, "We'll run this through Caroline before finalizing." No one argued. I sat there, nodded, and kept my expression neutral. But inside, I felt a quiet swell of something close to pride, not because I needed the attention, but because for the first time, my voice didn't echo into a void. It landed. It mattered. The irony was that I had spent so long trying to be small, to not take up space I hadn't been invited into. Years of training myself to sit on the edge of the chair, to speak with caution, to never sound like I thought I knew better. But now I was learning that leadership didn't mean volume. It meant clarity. When I spoke, I had already done the math, run the scenario, mapped the consequence. I didn't have to convince anyone, I just had to say it plainly. Still, there were moments when I questioned it. Imposter syndrome doesn't vanish just because people start listening. I'd lie awake at night sometimes, wondering when the illusion would crack, when someone would pull me aside and say, "We've realized you don't actually belong here." But morning came, and the questions did 2 questions from real colleagues, about real problems, and I answered them. Every time I did, that voice in my head got a little quieter. What surprised me most wasn't the respect from my coworkers. It was hearing someone outside of my department mention me like I was part of the infrastructure. One afternoon, I passed by the sales team's open meeting room and overheard a manager saying, "We'll need to check with Caroline. She knows the system better than anyone." It stopped me mid-step. I don't think he saw me. He wasn't performing. He just meant it. That was the day I stopped second-guessing myself. That night, I called my mom. We hadn't spoken much lately, but I wanted to tell someone, even if I didn't know what words to use. I said, "Work's going well," and she said, "That's good," in a soft voice I hadn't heard in years. I didn't tell her about the whiteboard, or the launch, or the hallway compliment. It felt too fragile, too internal. But I think she heard the steadiness in my voice. Maybe that was enough. I didn't need my father to say it. I didn't need a ceremony. I just needed to know I wasn't a ghost in the building anymore. My voice wasn't borrowed. It was mine. And people finally heard it. It happened on a Tuesday. Nothing about that morning felt different. The same stale coffee in the break room, the same emails I opened and flagged, the same calendar filled with vendor calls and back-end cleanup. I was wearing my usual blazer, not to impress anyone, but because it made me feel grounded. We had just closed a small Series B funding round, and most of my day was booked with follow-ups and implementation planning. I was in the middle of reviewing a staffing spreadsheet when I heard a knock on the glass panel next to my desk. One of the HR assistants stood there, a clipboard in hand and a hesitant look on her face. She said we had a new applicant on site for an executive banking liaison position. Apparently, there had been a scheduling mix-up, and no one briefed me. She handed me the resume. My fingers paused halfway through scrolling. The name stared back at me like a glitch in the Matrix. Richard Myers. It wasn't a common name, but common enough that I didn't immediately panic. Then I scanned the rest. Senior banking manager, 28 years at Franklin Commercial. Last role terminated following a merger. Alma mater, same as my father's. Then the line at the bottom. References available upon request. And I knew. It was him. I didn't react, at least not outwardly. I simply nodded and asked them to send him to Conference Room B. Then I stood, smoothed the hem of my blazer, and walked down the hall. I didn't tell anyone else. No dramatic build-up, no confiding in the founders. This wasn't their story. It was mine, and I needed to see it through. I stepped into the room before he arrived. I adjusted the chair, turned the lights slightly dimmer, and pulled out the interview worksheet I'd been using all month. My hands were steady, my breath oddly calm, and then he walked in. He looked older than I remembered, grayer, a bit stooped, but still carrying that posture of confidence that bordered on arrogance. He wore a suit, not tailored, but clean, and his expression was one of polite anticipation. When he saw me, he blinked. He didn't recognize me. Not immediately. He offered a firm handshake and said, "Richard Myers, thank you for making time." I returned it and simply said, "Caroline." I watched the name land. I watched his posture change, his mouth open, and then close again. 1,000 thoughts probably ran through his mind in that moment. He hadn't seen me in years, not since that awkward Thanksgiving dinner when he asked me if I was still playing with numbers. He hadn't been cruel, just dismissive. Always dismissive. I gestured for him to sit. He did. For the next 30 minutes, I conducted the interview like any other. I asked about his previous role, about client migration strategies during the merger, about how he handled legacy systems. He answered carefully, like a man who'd spent his career speaking in boardrooms. But I saw the cracks. The way his eyes flicked toward my nameplate. The way his hands fidgeted when I asked technical questions. He wasn't expecting this. Not me. Not here. Halfway through, he finally said it. "You're doing well for yourself." It wasn't quite a question. It wasn't quite approval. It was acknowledgement, and it came wrapped in disbelief. I didn't reply. Instead, I asked about his experience managing multi-platform risk assessment. He stumbled through the answer. I noted it on the form. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't kind. I was neutral, professional, measured. When the interview ended, I stood, shook his hand again, and thanked him for coming. He left without saying much more. As the door closed behind him, I stood alone in the conference room for a moment, staring at the empty chair. My chair. And I realized something I hadn't expected. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt still, the kind of stillness that comes after a long, grinding climb when you stop, turn around, and finally see how far you've come. Not to gloat, not to prove anything, just to know. He had once told me that college would be a waste of money, that I would never need a degree because I'd marry out of ambition, that I wasn't worth the investment. And now, 10 years later, He was sitting across from me, hoping for a job. There was no revenge in that room, only math. 10 years of work, one pivot after another, 1,000 tiny decisions. Survival turned into strategy, strategy into structure. It was never about him, but it was satisfying to watch the equation balance itself. The morning after the interview with my father, I expected to feel some kind of hangover, emotional or otherwise. But instead, I felt a strange clarity, like my mind had been a cluttered desktop for years, and someone had finally dragged the last useless file to the trash. I walked into the office, poured my coffee, checked my inbox, and dove into our quarterly operations review without missing a beat. No one on the team suspected anything unusual had happened the day before. And why would they? To them, it had just been another candidate. To me, it had been a closed loop. A long-held tension finally uncoiled. That week, I had back-to-back calls with our legal consultant, an investor from San Francisco, and 2 department leads I was mentoring into more autonomous roles. I didn't have time to linger on sentiment. I was too busy managing the future, but that didn't mean the past didn't leave fingerprints. Late Thursday afternoon, our CEO, Aaron, stopped by my office with 2 cans of sparkling water and a raised eyebrow. "You good?" he asked, handing one over. I nodded, maybe too quickly. He leaned against the doorframe and said, "We got a thank you note from one of the candidates. Said it meant a lot to be interviewed by someone who clearly knew the business inside and out." I took a sip, said nothing. Aaron smiled. "You've built something real here. Just thought you should hear it out loud." Then he left. I sat with that for a while. Recognition is funny. You spend so much time trying not to crave it, trying to prove to yourself that your work is enough, that external validation is just noise, and then one clean sentence from someone you respect lands with more weight than 100 sleepless nights. I didn't cry. I didn't even smile, but I wrote the words down in my notebook because they felt like a marker on the map. A new page. In the weeks that followed, I was asked to lead a panel at a regional fintech conference. The topic was scaling operations without losing culture. It was the kind of invite I used to dream about and then dismiss as fantasy. Now it came via email with a subject line that read, "Your voice is needed." I prepped hard. Outlines, case studies, key takeaways. Not because I doubted myself, but because I knew exactly what it meant to be the only woman on a panel of men who'd each been handed more than I'd ever been offered. I wasn't angry about it anymore, but I wasn't naive either. The day of the event, I stood backstage listening to the host read bios. When he got to mine, he said, "And Caroline Myers, COO of Echelon, a fast-growing infrastructure startup known for its efficient scaling systems and innovative operations model." I had to stop myself from laughing. The word innovative made me think of grocery lists and overdue rent and the half-broken espresso machine at my first internship. But maybe that was innovation too. I walked on stage. The room was full but not overwhelming. I could see faces, hear coughs, feel the low hum of anticipation. I spoke clearly, not loudly. I made eye contact. I didn't fidget. And when the moderator asked about leadership, I said something that wasn't rehearsed but felt entirely true. Leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about being trusted to ask the right questions, especially when no one else wants to. People nodded. Someone in the front row took notes. And in that moment, I felt it not power, not victory, but permission. Permission I no longer needed from anyone but myself. After the panel, a young woman approached me near the hallway snack table. She looked barely 22, holding a notepad like it was armor. She said, "I didn't think someone like me could end up on that stage." I looked at her, really looked at her. "Neither did I said. She smiled, thanked me, and disappeared into the crowd. On the train ride home, I stared out the window, thinking about that moment, about how many years I'd spent craving someone to say, "You're doing okay," and how it finally meant something only after I no longer needed to hear it. I thought about the word trust. Trust wasn't something I had been given. It was something I had earned, transaction by transaction, mistake by recovery, hour by hour. And now it was something I gave to my team, to my peers, to people like that young woman with the notepad. It wasn't credit in the bank. It was credit in belief. And I was done waiting for someone else to approve the loan. The email came from HR. No subject line, just the auto-tagged thread. Interview confirmation, Wednesday 2 p.m. I almost deleted it without reading. We were in the middle of restructuring onboarding workflows, and I was already juggling 2 candidate evaluations and a team conflict over ownership boundaries in our infrastructure sprint. But something made me open it. There, in the body of the message, was the name I hadn't seen since I was 18. Richard Myers. Again. Except this time it wasn't a glitch. It was scheduled. Apparently, he had made it through the preliminary filters. His resume had passed the first scan, and the recruitment software didn't recognize the connection. Why would it? Our HR team was decentralized, operating across 4 time zones, and turnover in mid-level leadership roles was high. No one pieced together the surname. And why should they? No one in that department knew my father's name. Except me. The irony struck deep. 10 years ago, he didn't think I was worth tuition. Now, he was asking for a second interview at a company where I helped build the hiring matrix he had just passed through. I stared at the screen for a full minute before closing the tab. I didn't reschedule. I didn't cancel. I let the clock run. 2 days later, at exactly 2:00 p.m., he appeared in the lobby slightly more put together than last time, suit sharper, posture forced into a controlled confidence. I watched on the monitor for a second. He kept glancing around. He still hadn't recognized the building, hadn't noticed the name etched on the glass plaque inside the entryway. Chief Operating Officer Caroline Myers. I met him in the conference room. This time I didn't hesitate. I shook his hand, introduced myself, and gestured for him to sit. He did. There was a flicker of realization behind his eyes, but he masked it well. The silence stretched between us, but I filled it with data. "This is a Level 3 advisory operations role," I said. "You'll be expected to manage workflows across finance, legal compliance, and enterprise integration. We're currently scaling B2B logistics in 4 cities. Tell me how you'd approach vendor risk in cross-border contracts." He paused, then answered, "Not poorly, but not exceptionally." I took notes, not as his daughter, as the COO. He tried to steer the conversation toward legacy systems, what he knew best. But I redirected, asked about CRM migration timelines, suggested a hypothetical where his department would be required to consolidate budgets with engineering. He stumbled again. It wasn't malicious. He was just out of sync. The business world had moved fast in 10 years. I had lived every step of that acceleration. He hadn't. Then came the shift. He leaned forward, eyes slightly narrowed. "I know who you are," he said quietly. I looked up. "Good. Then you know this isn't personal." He hesitated. I watched him try to calculate his next move, not as a father, but as a man trying not to sink the only boat still within reach. He nodded. "I respect what you've built." I didn't respond, because the truth was, I hadn't built it for respect. I built it for stability, for autonomy, for every girl who was told she wasn't worth the investment. For myself, back when I had nothing but a night class registration form and a 2-job schedule. And yet, sitting across from him in that sterile conference room, I felt no fire, no revenge, only an odd weightlessness. I had climbed the ladder he never let down, and now I was the one holding it. We wrapped the interview with scripted professionalism. I gave him the standard closing line, "We'll be in touch in the coming week." He nodded, thanked me again, and left. When the door clicked shut, I stayed seated for a while. Let the silence settle. Let the echoes fade. I thought about what it had cost me, those years of grind, of silence, of refusing to look back. And I thought about what it had cost him. The connections he used to boast about were gone. The roles he once looked down on were now the ones lifting me up. And still, I felt no need to punish him. I forwarded the evaluation form to HR, wrote, "Not a fit for the role. Recommend candidate not proceed." No emotion. Just truth. Then I closed the tab, opened a new one, and got back to work. Because what I was building now wasn't about proving anything. It was about moving forward, full speed, with no need to look back. The email came 3 days after the interview. It wasn't sent to my work address. It landed in my personal inbox, the one I used sparingly now, mostly for old accounts or newsletters I didn't read. I almost missed it. The subject line was blank. The name in the sender field stopped me cold. Richard Myers. No title. No dad. Just a name. My heart didn't race. I didn't feel the old rush of heat to my face that used to come when I'd see his name on a piece of mail or hear someone mention him in passing. Those days were gone. Instead, I felt the familiar buzz of distance, like hearing an old song you've memorized, but no longer sing. I opened it. There were only 4 lines. "Caroline, I understand. I hope you're proud of what you've built. I'm sorry for everything." No greeting, no signature, just a plain text message with no attachments, no formatting, no requests. I read it once, then again. The words didn't change, but something in me softened. Not because I wanted an apology. I'd stopped needing one a long time ago, but because it was the first time he acknowledged what I had done, and, more importantly, what he had not. I didn't reply, not out of spite, and not because I didn't have anything to say, but because silence, in that moment, was the only language I trusted. Any response, any sentence I could have sent would have reopened a conversation I no longer needed. He said what he needed to say, and I had nothing left to prove. That night, I sat on the balcony of my apartment, legs tucked under me, nursing a mug of lukewarm tea I'd forgotten about. The city moved below me, honking cars, scattered voices, the hum of late-night deliveries, and I let myself feel the stillness that followed closure. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just enough. I thought back to all the letters I'd never sent, the messages I wrote in my head during the hard years when I was clocking out of one job to run across town to another, when I was building spreadsheets at 2 a.m. to keep up with coursework, when I was watching peers celebrate graduation while I worked the coat check at their banquet halls. Letters full of bitterness, sarcasm, hunger for recognition. None of them had made it past my own mind. None of them had been needed in the end. Now he had sent his own letter, simple, unpolished, but real. And maybe that was all it had ever taken. I never told anyone at the office, not Jack from finance, who once walked me through my first fundraising model, not Megan from strategy, who knew bits and pieces about my family, not Aaron, who had trusted me with more responsibility than I'd dared ask for. This wasn't their thread to pull. It was mine, and I chose to leave it knotted, unfinished, intact. A week later, I archived the email. Didn't delete it, didn't reread it, just moved it to a folder I rarely opened, one labeled Old Files, tucked between outdated resumes and scanned copies of old leases. It was done. There was no fanfare, no cathartic sobbing, Just a quiet moment of acknowledgement between two people who had once shared a last name and little else. I didn't forgive him. Not completely. But I no longer needed to hold the weight of his disbelief. It had never really been about him. That weight, I realized, had always been mine to carry and mine to set down. And finally, I had. The walls of my office were bare, not out of laziness or a lack of sentiment, but by choice. I had watched too many people clutter their spaces with reminders of borrowed pride certificates, magazine features, photos taken with people more famous than themselves. I didn't want any of it, not because I wasn't proud of what I had built, but because I wanted the room to feel like what it represented. Clarity, focus, unapologetic independence. My desk sat centered near a wide window, flooded with natural light in the morning and golden dusk by evening. The only thing hanging was a whiteboard filled with scribbled deadlines and project flows. People who visited always said it felt clean. Some meant it as a compliment, some as a passive critique. But for me, it was peace. One afternoon, I found myself staring at that whiteboard after a long strategy session. A visiting executive from another firm had just stepped out, having spent most of the meeting talking over me until Aaron casually said, "Caroline built this company's backbone. If she's not talking, it means she's thinking harder than you are." That sentence echoed in my mind longer than it should have. Not because I needed Aaron's defense, but because it reminded me how far I had come from being the girl who once rehearsed every line before raising her hand in class, terrified of sounding foolish. I walked over to the board, erased a line that no longer served us, and redrew the workflow without hesitation. This room had become my reflection. No noise, no ornaments, just purpose. Sometimes people asked why I didn't keep family photos here. Not even one. I always smiled and said, "This space is about what I've created, not where I came from." Most accepted that answer. A few pressed further. Once, a junior employee joked, "What? No high school graduation pic? No proud dad frame?" I laughed with her, light-hearted, but didn't say what I was thinking. There had never been a proud dad photo. There had never been a ceremony where he clapped from the front row, or a congratulatory card slipped into my hand with trembling pride. The few photos I did have of us were stiff, obligatory Christmas mornings with polite smiles, distant family dinners where he checked his phone more than he met my eyes. And when I walked the stage to collect my degree, no one waited at the end of the aisle with a hug. I had gone alone, celebrated in silence, bought myself dinner that night with a tip from my coffee shop shift. So, no, I didn't need those pictures on my wall. What I had instead were contracts framed in confidence. A team that came to me not because I carried a last name, but because I carried them through systems and chaos and deadlines. I had receipts literal and metaphorical that told the real story. And I had quiet, a quiet that didn't ache. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the windows amber, I looked at the empty stretch of wall across from my desk. For a brief second, I imagined a portrait there. Not of anyone else, just me. Not posed, not airbrushed. Just a candid photo, maybe from a retreat or one of those rare moments when someone caught me laughing. The idea passed quickly. I wasn't looking for decoration. I was looking for depth. What stayed with me wasn't the portrait, but the awareness that this was a room built for now. Not memory, not nostalgia, just movement. Forward. Sometimes, in the quiet hum after hours, I would sit back in my chair and remember my father's study. His was filled with awards and old newspaper clippings. A wall of ego masked as legacy. He used to polish the frames every Sunday, making sure each one stayed sharp. I remember watching him once, wondering if he ever saw me standing there, if he ever imagined my name on anything. Now, mine was on the payroll, on the legal filings, on the dotted line under every major deal, but not on the wall, because what I had learned after all those years was that power doesn't need a portrait. It just needs a place to work without asking permission. There's a peculiar stillness that comes when you realize you've finally arrived somewhere you were never meant to be. Not because the place rejected you, but because no one ever imagined you'd even try. I felt it for the first time at a leadership retreat in Denver. It was a modest affair, no fireworks, no red carpets, just a gathering of minds from across industries. People who built things, people who moved markets. And somehow, I was one of them. My badge said, Caroline Myers, COO. I remember touching it a few times, like it might vanish if I didn't hold it steady. The room was full of conversations I used to read about in articles. People spoke in the language of scale and impact, mergers and ethical disruption. I wasn't intimidated. I was curious. I didn't want to prove I belonged. I wanted to use every second to learn, absorb, expand. That's what made the difference. During the closing dinner, a woman a few seats down from me, a founder of a medical logistics startup, turned and said, "You know what I love about you, Caroline? You take up space without asking for it." I didn't know how to answer at first. My instinct was to self-deprecate, to deflect. But instead, I looked her in the eye and said, "It took me a long time to realize I was allowed to." She nodded slowly. She understood. The next morning, I walked alone before my flight. The air was cool and dry, the kind that wakes you up from the inside. I stopped at a small bench overlooking a slope and sat with my thoughts. That's when it really hit me, this place, this role, this version of myself. I had built it brick by brick with hands that had once just carried someone else's expectations. And now, those expectations were gone. The space was mine. When I got back to the office, the hallway felt different. Not physically, but emotionally. The same desks, same sounds, same co-workers chatting about deadlines and lunch orders. But I noticed how many people looked toward me when a decision needed making. How their expressions softened slightly when I walked in relief, not fear. Like I was the stabilizing force in the room. That wasn't accidental. It was the result of years of showing up, solving problems, creating systems they could trust. And yet, there were still moments I questioned it. Not often, but sometimes. Like when someone asked, "So where do you see yourself in 5 years?" And I instinctively thought, trying not to lose what I've earned. Or when I visited old college friends who still introduced me as the one who made it, as if I'd been rescued rather than risen. But here's what I've learned about space. It's not just about what you take. It's about how you hold it. I didn't barge into rooms demanding attention. I earned it by listening first. I didn't name drop or inflate numbers to be noticed. I came with the receipts team retention stats, revenue benchmarks, retention strategies. Quiet authority is louder than people think. I started mentoring a few younger women in the company. Not because someone asked me to, but because I remembered what it felt like to sit at a table and be invisible. I told them the things no one told me, that uncertainty is not a weakness, that leadership starts long before you get a title, and that no one ever regrets walking into the room prepared. Sometimes, one of them would glance around during meetings, unsure where to sit. I'd catch their hesitation and pat the chair next to me. "Here," I'd say. "Sit here." Because no one ever did that for me, and I had learned that the fastest way to claim your space is to offer it to someone else first. One night, after everyone had gone home, I stayed late finishing budget revisions. It was dark outside, the building humming in its quiet, post-rush calm. I stood up, stretched, and walked to the window. My reflection met me in the glass, older, sharper, not harder. Behind me, the office looked organized, grounded, lived in. It no longer felt like I was visiting someone else's success. It felt like home. And that's the real triumph, isn't it? Not just building something, but knowing deep in your bones that you belong in the very place no one saved for you. The final twist didn't come with drama. It came with a calendar notification. I was in the middle of finalizing vendor contracts for Q3 when the meeting reminder popped up on my screen. Advisory Board Proposal, Richard Myers. I blinked at the name, unsure for a second if it was real. But there it was. The board had floated his name as a potential external advisor for our finance strategy committee. The selection process was independent, reviewed by an external recruiting firm. They had no idea about the history. To them, he was just a respected former senior VP with years of experience and a clean reputation in traditional banking. To me, he was the man who once said I wasn't worth the tuition fee of a local college. I stared at the screen for a full minute, then leaned back and let out a quiet breath. My first instinct was to flag the conflict, remove myself from the vote, keep it clean. But then I remembered something I'd said not long ago to one of our analysts. Growth isn't just what you build, it's what you're able to look at without flinching. I didn't remove myself. Instead, I requested to lead the preliminary interview, under the same conditions we used for every other candidate. It was scheduled 2 weeks later, virtual, 25 minutes. I logged on early, adjusted my camera, reviewed the criteria. When the Zoom window opened and his face appeared, I was struck by how much he'd aged. The same gray suit, the same posture, but less guarded now. More weathered, maybe even tired. He greeted me formally. No mention of who I was, no acknowledgement. I returned the formality and began the standard interview questions. He answered efficiently, maybe a little too rehearsed. I listened carefully, occasionally probing into his views on risk modeling and decentralized oversight. He faltered once, then regained pace. He was good, but not remarkable. And I was no longer here to impress. At the end of the session, I asked the final question we always included. Can you tell me about a time your perspective shifted significantly after working with someone you underestimated? He paused. It wasn't a long pause, but enough to feel real. Then, he said, I once believed that outcomes were tied to where people came from. I've since learned they're more often tied to what people decide not to give up on. That was a costly mistake. I said thank you and ended the meeting. He wasn't chosen, not because I blocked him, but because our final shortlist prioritized fintech agility over legacy institutional background. He wasn't the right fit. But something lingered. A week later, I got a handwritten letter delivered to the office. No return address. Just a cream-colored envelope and familiar script. Inside, he wrote, I don't expect anything, but I needed to say it, finally. You didn't just prove me wrong. You rewrote the script I used to follow, and you did it with more grace than I deserved. Whatever you've built, it's more than impressive, it's yours. Entirely. I hope, in some way, that gives you more than I ever could have. There was no signature, but I didn't need one. I sat with the letter in my lap, the office quiet around me. Outside the glass walls, my team moved like a well-rehearsed orchestra, solving problems, pitching ideas, checking in on each other. Every part of this place hummed with intention, with balance, with the kind of quiet power that no one could take from me. I folded the letter once, slid it into the drawer where I kept a few small personal things, and closed it gently. Not as a trophy, not as a wound, but as a receipt. Proof that sometimes the return on your pain doesn't come all at once, but when it does, it carries interest. Not in money, not in praise, but in freedom, in finality, in knowing that the door that once slammed in your face now opens only if you choose to unlock it. And some doors are better left closed, not out of bitterness, but because you've built better ones, stronger ones with your name on them, in your own handwriting, in permanent ink,